I would like to linger for a little while on criteria. The question you've answered is whether you actually establish your criteria before you begin, or whether you evolve these criteria. And what you're telling me, in fact, is that it evolves in the process.
Well, I would describe it like that. Whether Justin and Carmen would, I'm not clear.
Would you agree with that, Carmen?
I couldn't hear what he said. What did he say?
I was asking whether you actually establish your criteria before you began discussing potential prize winners.
I don't think I consciously had criteria, but I've got criteria that are particular to me. And I think the first thing I look for is genius, really. And if somebody's got genius, I forgive loads of other things. Storytelling and writing, prose. But nobody told me to have any criteria, and so I think the three of us had different ones.
So Justin, is there anything that you...
Yeah, we did actually start at one point with the suggestion that we shouldn't have any Nobel Prize winners.
Yes.
But I thought, in fact, that would be a personal decision. You didn't need to reveal you didn't want somebody because they'd won the Nobel. But the criteria for me have always been... I mean, it was interesting because I think we had different criteria, even though, as Carmen said, we didn't express them. But for me, it's always been the quality of the writing. So I can read a whole book with one good sentence and be very happy with it. You know, things like Saul Bellow describing somebody as having eyebrows like caterpillars on the tree of knowledge. You know, that for me, I could read a whole book just for that phrase. And so we had different criteria. I don't think storytelling as such would have been one of mine, although I appreciate that it's a very important thing in literature. But we also had disagreements, but I don't want to suggest it was a kind of sea of lack of tranquility. It was all pretty peaceful and we worked through it. But we had very fundamental differences of temperament, I think, rather than of literary choice, and that was something we had to cope with. And so I think it's true to say that the original, I think we all drew up a list of 10 when we started, and I don't think any of mine survived to the final cut, and Rick said only one originally survived. So it was a process of getting to, in a sense, though, we were spoiled for choice. There were so many good writers on the list from the beginning that it was really a question of refining our understanding of them.
Thank you.
What was really interesting is I asked both of them, and I myself made a list of 10 people at the very beginning who we thought were kind of our favorites. And there was only one name on all the lists, and that person didn't survive the process.
Who was that, Rick?
I'm not saying.
Thank you all. Right, Carmen. The Man Booker International builds its aspiration to considering all the world's literature into its title. Now, this involves considering literature in translation, and translation itself features amongst the awards. Could you please expand on this and perhaps give us some idea of how much satisfaction you derive from this aspect of the Man Booker International Prize, the aspect of translation and the way translation is built into the award?
Well, that's a very large subject, so I shall hope not to be too lengthy about it. But what actually happened was when it came to finding authors in what I call abroad, I did a lot of research, made a lot of lists, did a lot of investigation, and I started to read. And one of the first problems that faced me, most particularly with Arabic writing and Chinese writing, though even when I read a novel from Sri Lanka, it still had the same problem. Quite often when you're reading a translation, there are various problems. The first is, quite often you know that you're reading what the writer actually meant, the novelist, through a pane of glass. You feel it. But actually, as you go on doing that, you can get a measure of the writer behind it, and you get to know, particularly if they've had different translators, what the measure of the writer, the novelist is. The second problem is that we're Anglo-Saxons and that we speak English, because we translate less than any other language or country. I mean, if you're French or Italian, you get much more opportunity to read some of these writers than we do, particularly Chinese, for example. When I was trying to find some novels by Wang Anyi, there are many more available in French, and I had to really get some from sort of Serbo-Croatia to finish my reading of her work. But she is a very good example of what some of the troubles were with translation. She's written a trilogy, which is Love in a Small Town, Love in a Barren Mountain, and Brocade Valley. And they're all very intense novels about sex and love, and most extraordinary, quite wonderful. Two of them are translated by a translator in Hong Kong. And those you do get the measure of her writing. One of them is published by an American publisher, and that comes over with a very portentous sort of English. But because I'd read the other ones, I realized that the American translation was very bad. So as time went on, I had to apply those sort of things, and we all did, to every single country we were reading the translations of. And I do have an enormous body of thought in my brain as to what needs to happen to some of these writers, and many of them need entirely to be retranslated and republished. Because the other thing they do to them, these awful publishers, is they put the words on a page with no lines between them, and as many lines as they can get in because they want to save money. So you're reading through a dense jungle of badly translated, it's hell. I mean, they really need to be published like proper books and beautiful pages and proper covers, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Rick, can I come back to you, please? You said this morning at the press conference that you didn't want to discuss the hundreds of great writers whom you've not selected, but you'd rather concentrate instead on the ones you have selected.
That seems right of me, yeah.
Right, but you must have sensed, and you must continue to sense, controversy.
Yeah.
In coming to any decision with a large international prize of this kind. And my question is a simple one.
Yeah.
Is it more important to get it right or not to get it wrong?
I can't imagine any committee sitting down and saying, okay, chaps, we mustn't get this one wrong. Of course we want to get it right, and we have worked our socks off to do so, and I'm absolutely convinced that on the day we will come up with a name that all of us can put our hands on our hearts and say, this is a person whose work we wish to recognize and to honor. It is, after all, for all of us, a chance of a lifetime to say thank you to one of the great writers of the world. It seems to me that's a wonderful privilege, a wonderful responsibility, but most of all, it's been a tremendous pleasure. I can't tell you how much fun this has been. And at the end of it, we're going to sit back, and I'm absolutely certain we're going to come up with the name of a great writer.
And perhaps Justin Carman might like to comment on how much pressure, if any, you felt about the sort of public nature of what you were involved in, for all the fact that you were confined in someone's kitchen in London, discussing the possibility. What decision you made would obviously have very real
I personally didn't feel any pressure, and we didn't try and find a regional spread. We didn't try and find an equal balance of translated and untranslated, women and men. I don't think that came up hardly. I didn't feel any pressure at all. But I just going to say something about translation. I mean, I've been aware for a very long time that translation is tricky. My very first book that was translated into Spanish. I was very excited and went along to Barcelona. And a journalist came up and she said, "Is this book supposed to be funny?" And I said, "Well, it is in English." She said, "But it's not in Spanish." And so I've been aware for a long time that, I've been aware for a very long time that it's not easy. I know you've done Spanish, but it's true. What Carmen was saying is true. A lot of the books we read, at least a lot of the books I read, the translations were appalling. And you cannot believe the writer could have meant that, but in the back of your mind, you don't know. Maybe the writer did mean that, and exactly that. And I tried to cross-check some books that were written in French, and they were Creole books, Patrick Chamoiseau, and so I read the originals in French. And I couldn't really check it. The French was beyond me. The Creole French. So it's a tricky business, and I think Carmen's absolutely right in saying this is an area that the world, and particularly the Anglophone world, needs to take very seriously. And the Vice-Chancellor said that it's, although I don't think we want consciously to say we're going out to understand other cultures, that's the great benefit of great literature from any country and other countries. And I think the best example that we don't even talk about now is that we basically all see Russia and Russian literature in terms of the books that were translated in the 19th century, or the plays we saw of Chekhov and so on. It forms your image, just as Dickens, if you say Dickensian about parts of London, you know exactly what that means. And so that is really the effect, and that's why it's terribly important there should be good translations, so we do understand China better. And I think we all have through these two great Chinese authors, but also there are things like Marilyn Robinson's very understated book set in Iowa, which are a complete revelation about Midwestern life. Not translation, strictly speaking, but as somebody said last night, you need to realize that translation is not strictly just about language into language. It's about feeling and perception and all kinds of important things like that.
I think there's also the assumption that translation into English involves something simple at one end, which is English. But there is often a great difference between English, and, for instance, American English. And you'll get an American professor using American vernacular terms, which simply don't read well to an English ear at all. So you need quite a lot of sensitivity about that. I read one of the novels set in North Africa, and there was a terrifically sadistic imprisonment of some prisoners who were kept underground for 20 years. And one of the guards was particularly nasty and sadistic and made these people's lives hell. And the translator, who was an American professor, described that guard as really mean.
There's an awful lot of mom and pop and sis too.
Oh, God, yes.
It's really not good because American academia has the money quite often to translate these people. So it's got to be...
You have, sorry, Carmen. You have actually another problem, which is that, I mean, the classic is the Harold Pinter play, The Birthday Party, which has a line that any Australian would appreciate when McCann's threatening Goldberg and says, "You're the person who watered the wicket in Melbourne." You know, a heinous charge in the Anglo-Saxon world, translated by the Germans as, "You're the person who pissed on the gate in Melbourne." I mean, that's really obfuscating translation, it's going backwards rather than opening up. But it wouldn't have helped to send him a copy of Wisden, I'm sure, the translator.
Right. Can I ask Carmen and Justin a question about category? We've seen, say since the 1970s, a number of different kinds, fashions if you like, genres of literature. We've seen metafiction, we've had magic realism, we've had grunge fiction, we've had post-colonial fiction, things like that. I'd like to ask how aware you were of these different genres or categories, if you like, when you were judging, and how far that actually entered into the discussion of individual writers, the question of genre.
Well, I never thought of it at all. So you'll have to refer that to Justin. It's not the sort of thing that goes on in my mind,
Okay.
categories, actually. And in fact, until you raised that, I didn't know what metafiction was. So you see, I really can't answer that question very satisfactorily.
I did explain to him what metafiction was. But I don't know what grunge fiction is. But anyway, my view is slightly different. I think that there was a sense, if you're talking about magic realism, that it was much more imaginative than, just realist fiction. And that, of course, is nonsense, because you can only write from within your own consciousness. So that it's still an act of the imagination. Julian Barnes's famous thing in Flaubert's Parrot, when he describes magic realism, the plot gets a bit thin, so somebody turns from a nun into a donkey and appears on the top of a mountain. That isn't really very difficult. But if you take, say, John Updike's credo, which is that you take the ordinary and make it extraordinary in novels, that is just as difficult. It's just as much an act of the imagination. The thing about fashions in literature is that they must be done well. You need to, just writing in something that you academics identify doesn't make it a better novel.
Yes, and I do think that I'd make a caveat there. When I started to read Juan Goytisolo, I knew perfectly well I was dealing with a postmodernist. And I mean, I knew that and I recognized that, but I didn't give it much consideration. I just realized he was a brilliant one. So he was, and he is different from the others on the list, isn't he? There's no question about it. Yeah. So from that point of view, that's as much category as I managed to absorb.
What is grunge fiction, by the way, Will?
It's an often aggressive, very violent, vulgar in form of literature that
You're writing.
is a kind of provocation. It's in your face, as they say. In fact, it's sustained in your face.
Now we know.
Who's the main exponent? American Psycho, would that be grunge
I
fiction?
suppose a very popular one that's well known would be something like Trainspotting.
Train spotting.
Yes,
Of course, I know what you mean. Misery in the North.
Yeah.